Imagine this. A 6-year-old child was placed on a throne to bring peace between two empires. But no one knew. That child would become the symbol of a crumbling kingdom. Her yes at the altar would trigger a chain of events that toppled a king, shattered a dynasty, and left her imprisoned, not in chains, but in silence. If you want to know how a 6-year-old girl was pulled into one of the most brutal political games of the Middle Ages, stay until the end. And if forgotten stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing. History remembers kings who waged wars, queens who ruled empires, and marriages that reshaped nations. But it often forgets those who suffered quietly, those whose lives were never theirs to begin with. Among those forgotten souls was a little girl named Isabella of Valois. She was just 6 years old when she was forced to marry the King of England. Not 16, 6. Her husband? Richard II, 29, a king clinging to fading power. It was the 1390s, and England was locked in a bitter generational war with France. Peace was elusive, and power demanded sacrifice. Isabella, the daughter of the French king, was chosen as the offering. Not for her wisdom, not for her voice, but because she was young, royal, and useful. Picture it. A child wrapped in ceremonial robes, barely tall enough to hold a crown, speaking vows she couldn't even comprehend. Her wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction, carried out between two kingdoms. She wouldn't return home. She wouldn't be allowed to be a child. She became Queen of England in title, but in truth, she was a living contract. What happened to Isabella after that marriage reveals far more than just a stolen childhood. It exposes the quiet violence of royal diplomacy, where girls were currency and innocence had no weight. England was cold, in more ways than one. After the wedding, Isabella was taken from the French court to a kingdom where nothing felt familiar. She didn't speak the language. She didn't understand the customs. She was surrounded by adults who bowed to her, yet never saw her as more than a tool of diplomacy. They called her queen, but her crown weighed nothing, and meant even less. Isabella lived under heavy supervision in royal residences like Windsor and Wallingford. Every movement was managed. Every word was filtered through attendants. The girl who should have been learning to play, to grow, was now being trained to behave, to endure. Her toys were replaced with rituals, her questions with silence. And yet, strangely, King Richard II treated her with a kind of distant respect. Contemporary accounts suggest he didn't force intimacy, didn't demand affection. For a medieval monarch, that restraint was rare. But make no mistake, this wasn't kindness. He didn't see a wife, he saw a symbol. To Richard, Isabella represented peace with France, a final attempt to secure his rule. To his enemies, she was proof of his desperation. And to the people of England, she was simply foreign. While power shifted behind palace doors, Isabella was left in a kind of royal limbo. Too young to influence, too important to ignore, and too isolated to escape. At just 7 years old, she was already learning what it meant to be seen but never heard. For a brief moment, Richard II believed he had secured peace, with France, with his nobles, with time itself. But the illusion didn't last. The same instability that forced him to marry a child would soon consume his throne. In 1399, just a few years after Isabella's arrival, Richard left England to suppress a rebellion in Ireland. It was a mistake. While he was gone, his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, returned from exile and seized control. Nobles rallied behind him. Parliament turned. Within weeks, the crown slipped from Richard's head without a single battle. By the time Isabella was informed, her world had already shifted. She was just 10 years old, still a child, now the widow of a living man. Richard was captured, imprisoned, and quietly disposed of, likely starved or murdered in captivity. There was no official mourning, no public reckoning. His reign ended with silence, and so did Isabella's role as queen. The new ruler, Henry IV, had no use for her. She wasn't English. She had no heir. She was a political leftover, valuable only as leverage. Isabella was stripped of her titles and confined to the royal estate of Sonning. For years, her requests to return home were denied. She wasn't a threat, but she was a bargaining chip, and in Henry's game, everything had a price. But even pawns grow tired of waiting. In stories of kings and queens, power usually looks loud. Swords drawn, crowns lifted, declarations made. But Isabella's resistance was quiet, and it was real. After Richard's death, she was no longer queen, but neither was she free. For years, Isabella lived in political limbo. Henry IV kept her in England, refusing to let her return to France. Her presence was strategic, proof of his dominance over the previous regime, and a potential bargaining chip in future negotiations. But France began to push back. They wanted their daughter returned. Henry offered a compromise. Isabella could stay in England, if she agreed to marry his son, Prince Henry. On paper, it made sense. Politically neat, symbolically powerful. But Isabella said no. At just 11 or 12 years old, she refused the second marriage proposal forced upon her. No negotiations, no wavering. Some say it was pride, others grief. But perhaps it was something simpler. For the first time, she made a choice. Eventually, pressure mounted, and Henry allowed her to return home. The girl who had left France as a bride returned as a quiet survivor, changed but not broken. When Isabella returned to France, she wasn't the child bride from Calais anymore. She was older, quieter, and no longer the same girl who had once been called Queen of England. At age 15, she was married again, this time to Charles, Duke of Orléans. He was closer to her in age, and the match was political but less volatile. It was meant to heal reputations, not kingdoms. But something had changed. Isabella, once at the center of a royal conflict, had faded into the background. She took no political role, no public voice. She lived a private life, far from courts and conflict, rarely seen and barely recorded. For a woman once crowned in Westminster Abbey, her second marriage marked a retreat from history. And yet, that quiet may not have been weakness. Perhaps she no longer wanted to be used. Perhaps silence was her way of reclaiming herself. Sadly, peace didn't last long. At 19, Isabella died following a stillbirth, an all-too-common fate for women of her time. There was no great funeral, no national mourning, just a quiet burial for a woman history had already begun to forget. She had been queen, bride, widow, pawn, and finally, nothing at all. There are queens whose names echo through time, warriors, rulers, rebels. And then there are those like Isabella of Valois, silent, sidelined, and ultimately erased. She held the title of Queen of England before she could even read. She crossed a border as a symbol of peace, only to become a prisoner of politics. She survived the collapse of a monarchy, resisted a second forced marriage, and vanished into quiet domestic life, all before the age of 20. Isabella never ruled. She never led armies, issued decrees, or signed treaties. But what she endured reveals something just as important: that even the smallest figures in history can carry the weight of empires. She was born into madness, daughter of a mentally ill king, then traded between courts like currency. And when she was no longer useful, she was discarded, ignored, forgotten. But her story matters, because it reminds us of the human cost behind royal alliances, of the childhood stolen to keep dynasties afloat, and of how power, when unchecked, turns even the innocent into instruments of strategy. Isabella's name may not be in every textbook, but now you remember her. And sometimes that's enough to bring the forgotten back into history.